Thanks for having me, Michelle. I'm really excited about this presentation. As I was talking to Michelle a little bit beforehand, I was saying to her how important it is to be talking about this at the college level, because as we know, this can be a really rife place where imposter syndrome can blow up and kind of be exacerbated. And it can be a really lovely time for intervention so that you can actually address it. People can have tools and skills to be able to deal with it so they don't take it out into their work lives. And then in your work life, less people are interested in kind of being able to intervene on it. And so I think it's such an important moment. So I'm so happy that you all are here, and I'm so happy to have this conversation with you. I'm going to probably be chatting for about 45 minutes, and then I'm going to open it up to questions, and we can have a conversation, and I look forward to that. For those of you who may not know me, I am a psychologist, an executive coach, and my practice is in New York City. I work there with mostly high potential managers and executives, and I just wrote a book that came out in April called Own Your Greatness. It's about imposter syndrome. So I'm looking forward to having this conversation and discussing it. I'm going to share my screen now. And share my slides. So about 70% of us experience imposter syndrome over our lifetime. That's the most reported number. However, there's a recent study that just came out that says it's more around 82%. So it seems to be going up and not down. And if you've never heard of the phenomenon before, only recently heard of it, it's become very popularized. Michelle Obama recently admitted she has imposter syndrome. So I think it's become very much in the popular vernacular as a result of who's speaking about it recently. But the topic is over 40 years old. It was initially hypothesized and discussed by two psychologists who worked in a college counseling center named Clance and Imes, Pauline Clance and Suzanne Imes. And so while they were working at this college counseling center, they started to see faculty members, staff members, and graduate students that seemed to show this constellation of signs and symptoms, and they wondered, could they be shared? They didn't seem to be covered by any other phenomenon that they could understand or diagnosis, and they wondered, what was this? And so I think it is really fitting that they discovered it in a college counseling center, and that this becomes a very important moment and place for us to kind of really discuss the impact of imposter syndrome and how it looks and what cultures reinforce it. So some of the signs of imposter syndrome are that people are high achieving, they're incredibly skilled, they have expertise, they have qualifications, they have really concrete evidence of their skill level and their success. However, they often attribute this to an experience of luck, a mistake, overwork, or as a result of a relationship, that some relationship helped them escalate to the level that they're in. They often do not tolerate compliments or take in praise, typically feeling a sense of or a feeling of fear or guilt about their successes, often correlated to that experience of like attributing it to these other factors. They often also fear failure pretty intensely and being discovered as a fraud. And so that oftentimes really generates the behavior that is really central to generating the behavior related to imposter syndrome. They often also don't feel intelligent. It's also often correlated to perfectionism and this experience of overestimating others while underestimating yourself. It's also connected to a difficulty internalizing your feelings of success, your accomplishments, your degrees, your experience. And it's all often connected to overworking or self-sabotage to cover this feeling of inadequacy. So imposter syndrome is not a mental health issue. It's not a diagnosis. It's actually just considered a phenomenon that we see in people. It is, though, important to recognize, though, that there have been direct correlations to experiencing imposter syndrome and having depression and anxiety. Those are the diagnostic conditions that relate to it, but they're correlated. They are not often also solely from the imposter syndrome. They can be from other things, but they are correlated to imposter syndrome. When Clance and Imes discussed and discovered this phenomenon, they talked about the 4 hallmarks of imposter syndrome, the things that they saw that were most quintessential of people who had imposter syndrome. One is that they were very diligent and hardworking, and that was very much how they identified. It was very much that that was a central component of how they identified themselves as diligent and hardworking, and that was central to them. Also, they had this experience of intellectual inauthenticity, and what that was defined as was this experience of being in rooms where there are other people who are quite successful or in your kind of echelon of accomplishment, but you tend to downplay your skill, your ability, your knowledge to make everyone else feel comfortable in that arena. They also tended to feel that they were very charming and perceptive, that they knew how to manipulate people or to kind of get people to do what they wanted them to do. But what we have come to find out over the research over the 40 years is that people with imposter syndrome also have high emotional intelligence, and they often narrate or talk about that emotional intelligence as manipulation or charm. They dismiss it as actually an important and valuable skill, and they see it as sort of, charming and manipulative. Also, the purpose in which mentorship was often sought was for external validation. They didn't see oftentimes the full range of what a mentor could really do. And the mentoring relationship is especially important in academic settings. And for us to talk about that, I'm going to talk about some of the mentoring relationships that are pretty toxic to people who have imposter syndrome. But people with imposter syndrome tend to look just for the person with that mentoring relationship to tell them they were doing a good job, that they were, excellent, they were, achieving what they should be achieving. So it was only solely for external validation. So there are two cycles that people with imposter syndrome tend to get into. This is the first one. So typically it starts with a high visibility project, a project that is new, that's somehow a triggering project or event or something that you're responsible for. And then you engage in performance anxiety. So you have worry about the performance. In order to manage that worry about performance, you then overwork to cover up the fear of fraudulence. So I'm not talking about work hard in a normal sense, but a project that should take 20 hours of work, you exert 40 on it. So you work to a level that is far beyond what is expected for the project to cover up that fraudulence. You get a performance review, some evaluation of the project. Typically you will get approval because remember, they're very high achieving, but they don't internalize that approval. And then they once again begin the cycle again. The second cycle is the same kind of task comes up, worrying about performance, but then instead of doing the overwork, there's a procrastination or self-sabotage. So they push off the project to the very last minute, then engage in what is in essence a mini overwork cycle of overwork for short bursts in a certain period of time. They get a performance review. Because they perhaps didn't spend enough time or a long enough period of time on that they needed to, they either get a mixed review or a positive review. If there's a mixed review, they only internalize the negative. They only take in the negative and they kind of deny any kind of positive. And if it's positive, they let it go and it's as if it didn't happen. And then they sort of begin the cycle again. So there are a couple of different, there's a variety of childhood experiences that lead to imposter syndrome. I'm laying out some of the simple ones. Last week I talked about additional ones, but I'm just going to lay out some of the typical easiest ones that we can talk about so that you'll mostly see in academic settings really quickly. And so typically when you have imposter syndrome, you've had one of these three experiences in childhood, that you've been labeled in a particular role in your family, either as the smart one, or so the intelligent one in the family who got things very easily. And as a result of getting things easily, anytime you had to work at anything, it was proof to yourself that you weren't as smart as everyone thought you were. The ones who work hard, so you weren't considered naturally gifted or skilled at anything. You were considered the kind of person who knew how to be, who could really kind of grind and get things done. And when you worked hard, you could achieve anything. But it wasn't because you had any natural skill. So in your case, oftentimes it's this experience that you don't know how to really evaluate and see your natural gifts and skills and talents and strengths. Everything is attributed to working hard. And then the final one, which these first two have been very commonly talked about in literature, but when Richard and I, my partner, were writing the book, we noticed that there was a third type in our practice that wasn't really talked about in the literature. And that was when people they weren't considered the smart one or the hardworking one. They were considered, didn't have a lot of adult support. There was a lot of potentially neglect or abuse in the experience, and their accomplishments were focused on survival. So they had to work hard and get things done to survive. And so oftentimes in this particular dynamic, they often, no matter how accomplished they are, they're always worried that they're one step away from complete and utter loss of everything, because that's the way they felt growing up, is that they were working hard to survive. And so they don't necessarily attribute either one of those things to themselves, whether it's the working hard mentality or the intelligent. And so here, the way that imposter syndrome affects us can be impacted by gender. So here's some of the research on gender and some identity variables and imposter syndrome. So what they find with women who have imposter syndrome is that it doesn't prevent them from achieving. They still will face the things that they fear, but they do, as a result, they do constantly are dealing with the feelings of fraudulence. This has been specifically seen in STEM. And so oftentimes where, women experience imposter syndrome in relationship to STEM careers, they will actually still pursue the STEM career, but they're constantly plagued by this feeling that they're going to be found out. They tend to spend more time on academic tasks than those with imposter syndrome, and they have higher GPAs than men with imposter syndrome, and they tend to work harder when they receive negative feedback than people who don't have imposter syndrome. Men tend to do something a little differently, and so they tend to affiliate with peers that are less accomplished or as competent as they are. They want to be top of the game, so they want to be at the top of any kind of experience that they're in when they have imposter syndrome. So they take less risks. They're around peers that they feel superior to, which can affect their ability to advance or take risks or do more. And they're less likely to pursue, when you have high imposter syndrome, men are less likely to pursue careers in STEM. Now, for people of color, women, and first gen, there's what we call the double impact, which is that, clearly you're experiencing this imposter syndrome, you're having this internal experience of it. And when you're working on it, you're trying to really affect it and trying to believe that you are worthy, you do belong, you do have competencies. And then you get the message from the external world as a result of structural racism, as a result of sexism and all the different isms. You then hear that you don't belong, and you are, as a result, you're here because you're a result of a diversity program or this or that. You're hearing all these messages that tell you you are truly an imposter. And this particular double impact makes it particularly harder for people who are people of color, women, first gen, to really get over their imposter syndrome, because every time they work on it, something in the external world, it's likely for them to trigger it, to kind of push it back down and be like, nope, this is actually a real thing. So what the literature talks about is, for these groups, it is specifically incredibly important to have community along the identity variable that feels most impacted by the imposter syndrome. So it is important to find other people of like identity, to share the experiences, to feel that you're not being gaslighted in the environment, that when somebody says something that actually reinforces the imposter syndrome, you can actually counter it because there are other people who have experienced it too, know that it is untrue. So community is centrally important. I will say also here, there isn't a ton of research done on people who are gender non-binary, LGBTQ. There isn't a lot of research done on trans. There should be more research done on identity variables. There isn't a lot out there. It is not, since it is not a diagnostic condition, it gets a lot less funding, so a lot less people do the work. And there's still a decent amount of research out there, but it isn't extensive. And it probably needs more research around identity variables, because I think there's a lot of richness there that I think people experience it differently. So how does it affect college life? So some of the things that you see, with people who have high imposter syndrome is that they tend to overwork. They're also unable to find balance between their school lives and their personal lives. They have difficulty internalizing strengths. They'll have difficulty taking compliments. They'll have difficulty kind of taking a win. It's really difficult for them to really believe that or take that in from somebody. They typically feel undeserving and struggle to leverage moments that are, when they do get accolades and accomplishments, they don't know how to utilize them in a way that's helpful for them. What the research also finds is that they have a lower level of job and career satisfaction, and yet a greater organizational commitment. So what that means is that they typically are unhappy in their jobs, but they'll stay because their commitment to an organization can be incredibly strong. Beyond what the organization is giving them. So they often won't leave a job that they're unhappy with. They won't leave a situation they're unhappy with. Their idea is always that if they work harder, it will become better, but that is often not the case. And then also the research has indicated that they tend to have lower salaries and fewer promotions. And you can imagine why that might be. If you don't believe that you have any of these qualities are really true and that you've gotten them from luck, you're less likely to advocate for yourself. You're often likely to believe like, I should just be happy to be here, which affects your ability to have agency and actually affect change in your own professional life or in even in your work, in your kind of academic life in general as well. And they also have reduced knowledge of the job market. So oftentimes, because they are so focused on what is ahead of them and trying to just perform and do well, they don't often know what other options are out there, what other possibilities are out there, which often leave them also feeling like there is nothing better out there for them, which is why, these are some of the reasons why it is so important to affect the imposter syndrome, because this can have a long-term impact on them. So recently I did an article about with Today around how the pandemic is affecting imposter syndrome. And we talked about a bunch of things, but I wanted to also bring in some other pieces to this discussion around sort of how the pandemic may also be igniting imposter syndrome. So when you're adjusting when you're adjusting to new teaching and service delivery methods, these are not places where you feel expert oftentimes. This is not the way you've been doing your own profession for a long time. So it can trigger sort of feeling like inadequate and impostery. Also, there's been a lot, not only do you have to teach your discipline, but it's also managing reactions to the pandemic, racial injustice, the election uncertainty, which is adding a layer to everything. There are pressures to overwork and balance our personal and professional lives, especially since we are home. Like there's no clear boundaries now. It's much harder to set boundaries in traditional ways. And as a result, I think we are often really cognitively overloaded, and this affects our concentration and efficiency. And performance is so central to imposter syndrome. When you have imposter syndrome, it's so solely what you're thinking about is my performance and excelling and kind of being out there. But there's all these other factors that are affecting us which are igniting our imposter syndrome even further. And there's been some research out there, I'm sure you've seen it, which is that women are carrying greater household and childcare duties. BCG, the Boston Consulting Group, found that it's usually on average about 15 hours more than their partners, which is a lot of extra hours. And that, Black, Indigenous, people of color are also asking to be asked to be carrying a greater load around DE&I issues during this time. And expected to handle additional loads around this that may not be part and parcel of their jobs. And so what else are we seeing, that's happening that might be triggering even your own imposter syndrome? And this study just came out recently that said that women faculty members are authoring significantly fewer papers amongst the pandemic, probably influenced by the factors we were just talking about. This study was done in Lancet. I was looking at professors in medical school, but I'm imagining it may be generalized even further beyond that. Women are experiencing harsher student evaluations during this time than they've seen before, and they're thinking it's due to gender bias. And women of color are facing a greater demand from students and need for support and mentorship amid all the stuff going on, racial justice. So there's all this additional weight and stuff going on that makes it really hard to not overwork and not to be concerned about our performance in these times. And I think it's important to consider the context too, that may be specifically also affecting why it may be difficult at this time around your imposter syndrome. So there are typical roles that people with imposter syndrome tend to hold. These are some of them, right? So they really hate and don't understand sometimes the nature of failure and how failure can be a positive thing. So they avoid failure at all costs, typically. They often want to be really super helpful and like give of their time without sort of looking at how that giving may impact their own bandwidth. The helping is the most important thing, as opposed to thinking about sort of whether they're capable or can help. They often like to be the knowledge hub, the person who knows a lot about a lot of things and can be, sort of knowledgeable about everything. But that often can leave them feeling really insecure when they don't know an answer to something and feel really bad about themselves. They often will take this role of behind the scenes leader, like they'll run in group presentations, they'll be the one who does all the work and but doesn't want to be the one presenting it. So they'll typically, overwork in a way that's invisible. And they're often in this also super person role, like, they're the person to save the day, like someone needs something, they raise their hand. Like they're always there for everyone, not only in their work lives, but also everywhere else typically, is that they often want to come in and rescue and save. And like if nobody else can do it, they'll raise their hand, even if they can't manage the additional load. So some of the family dynamics that we see that are common in the early experiences of imposter syndrome are anger and conflict in a family that aren't well managed. So it's not that you can't have anger and conflict in a family, but when it feels like nobody can manage it, that feels really scary. The person with imposter syndrome's role in the family is usually to kind of help to soothe that and quiet it, to not create more issues related that would kind of inflame the anger. So they often get into these kinds of roles in organizations and academic situations as well. Strict family rules, like rules where, they're very rigid rules, and if you violate them, there are significant consequences. Families that don't really have closed systems where it's very hard to get to know people inside. You have to kind of really work hard to get inside the family. There's a very rigid nature to the family and its structure. No complexity in seeing people in situations. People have very like calcified roles in a family, and it's very hard for them to get known as anything else. So if you're the one who's the screwing up, you're going to always be the one screwing up. Even if like you do something good, they're just waiting for you to screw up again. There's really no tolerance for seeing complexity in people and for people to be many things. And then in these families also, we see a need to kind of like please, usually the parent figures or the adult figures, that the children are there to kind of please them and to just be pleasing to them. So as you can imagine from these dynamics, this produces a certain type of experience also in academic circumstances, where people will have a preference for particular mentoring styles or get themselves caught in mentoring relationships that are unhealthy for them. They're also, drawn to intense places of competition, but it also triggers significantly their imposter syndrome, because in intense competition, there are people who lose. I remember being in college and being a biology major and sitting down for my first day of class, and the first thing that there's like this classic experience. The first thing that the professor said is, look to your right, look to your left. Two of you won't be here at graduation as biology majors, and it's very threatening. It does, for someone with imposter syndrome, ignite this desire to prove, but it also leaves them in constant fear of never being good enough. So it is those kinds of dynamics that also can kind of get ignited. They struggle in environments where there is high affect, where professors are volatile, fighting, arguing. Which, I think can sometimes sound strange, but I remember in my own doctoral program, professors fighting in the hallway, screaming at each other. So there are these kinds of dynamics that happen that are particularly triggering for them. Also, where complexity is also not appreciated, where people get seen as a particular thing and then they can never move on. And then environments in which it's really about pleasing a senior academic figure than actually the student's growth. They're more focused on trying to win the favor of this academic figure than to actually be focused on what they need developmentally and in terms of their own growth. So what type of cultural frames sort of reinforce imposter syndrome? When performance objectives and goals are constantly shifting, where there's one goal and then all of a sudden, because either somebody met it or there's just been a shift, now there are new goals. And so this can be really hard when you have imposter syndrome, because the experience is like, I don't know what I need to do to actually, be able to achieve what I'm trying to achieve. So this performance objective and goal shifting can be really problematic culturally for them. Cultures that punish or humiliate mistake making. So when someone says the wrong answer or does something wrong, that there's like this culture to kind of embarrass or humiliate them, that can be very reinforcing of, I can never make mistakes. So these kinds of cultures, ones where there are stars and scapegoats, where there are people who are like the star of the class and then the one that is scapegoated in the class, the one everyone makes fun of. And so those kinds of behaviors also, because everyone knows in those, unconsciously they know that I'm one step away from being scapegoat. If I don't always get it right, if I don't always please, I could be that guy or that gal. So it's a really difficult thing to see that dichotomy. When there's no boundaries between personal and academic life. And I remember when I was in graduate school, sometimes going up to, my campus on a Sunday and seeing professors there on Sunday working all day. Meanwhile, I'd seen them all week. And sort of this idea that that was lauded, like, being there on a Sunday was something I should be doing too. So even teaching or modeling this idea that there are no boundaries. And where overworking is rewarded. So this idea of the more that you put in, the more that you kind of kill yourself, the more that you will be valued in the situation. That kind of cultural frame also reinforces imposter syndrome. So how does it show up when you're leading in an academic environment? It shows up by when you have imposter syndrome yourself, when you're an academic leader, it can show up by micromanaging others and overworking yourself. It can show up with not feeling good enough, or never feeling good enough. And no matter what you do, whatever new promotion you get or whatever new accolade, it never feels like enough. There's always something more to do to get into this feeling of like, I will be finally accepted. You have difficulty making mistakes yourself and difficulty tolerating it in others. Have trouble trusting others and collaborating. Trouble assessing your value and your contribution, and struggling with public attention. So these are some of the ways it can show up in leadership. Now, in terms of, I talked about mentorship and sort of advisors, mentors, all these roles that you may play with students. These are some of the types of mentoring that can be particularly triggering and unhelpful for people with imposter syndrome. So withholding mentors. So mentors who don't provide feedback unless you've reached the nth degree of like positive feedback, unless you've reached the nth degree. There's no rewarding of the gradual growth, the steps that someone's taking to actually get better and stronger. It's only when you reach the pinnacle. And sometimes even when you reach the pinnacle, they've now changed the pinnacle to something else. And so there's often a lot of withholding in that experience. They're expecting perfect performance, not like, not performance that is good or great. They're expecting perfect performance. It's the only way that they respect the performance. Otherwise, they are distant and non-engaging. So unless you're hitting the nth degree or being perfect all the time, they're not interested. So those particular mentors can be very triggering. Prove it to me mentors. So those are the ones who are constantly changing goalposts. You're only as good as your last project. You never feel like you can prove that you're good enough because there's always something more to prove. There's always something more to get. There's some new accolade. And they often use other mentees to threaten, position, or play mentees against each other. So sometimes they're having favorites, and the favorites can shift depending on who's behaving in the way that they approve or the way that so these kinds of, prove it to me mentors can be always about sort of like, kind of pleasing them and kind of focusing on their needs. Erratic mentors, so those are the ones that are difficult to predict, and as a result they're hard to understand. They can tend to be very unstable and cause a lot of chaos, and the mentees are never sure how to please them or how they will show up. So it's very erratic, and it can be very difficult when you struggle with imposter syndrome to feel like that you're ever know what to do, and that can be really, really difficult. And then the perfectionistic mentor doesn't tolerate mistakes, believes there's only one right way to do things or one right way to be in this particular discipline. They're very particular and exacting, and their feedback is usually intense and very intolerant. And insecure mentors, so they're not comfortable with their position or what they've achieved. They're easily threatened by others. They're concerned oftentimes about how their mentees their performance will reflect on them as a professor, or as, in whatever capacity they're in. So they're very concerned about that. And they're often also sometimes reversely concerned about the mentees, which is often very quiet, about how the mentee might surpass them. So they have this very complex relationship with the mentee. They struggle to take up their role in ways that they seem comfortable with. And this can be very disconcerting. So what can you do? What can you do to kind of really be able to address imposter syndrome when you see it in your experience, where you see these kinds of mentoring relationships, you see this kind of cultural experiences? What can you do? So you can model attending to your own imposter syndrome. So if 70% of us have imposter syndrome, 70% of professors, 70% of staff, most of us are probably dealing with this in one way or another. And dealing with your own and being open and honest with it can be incredibly liberating, both for yourself and for others, especially younger others that look up to you. Address open secret dysfunction. So there's I've worked in academia. I was a faculty member myself for many years. There's a lot of often open secret dysfunction in academic settings. People know the problems, people know what's happening, but nobody's saying something because someone's particularly powerful or particularly well, you know, has an endowed chairship, or all of these different things. So I think it's really important to take the secrets, to make the secrets like no longer like secrets, and that people discuss it. You build coalitions to figure out what can we do to kind of affect this. It might take a bit, but I think kind of really working to figure out how you deal with this and not leaving it as an open secret as students are impacted by whatever dysfunction is going on. Teach your students about imposter syndrome when you see it. Some of the most powerful, I mean, I think a lot of people worry about talking about this to other people, but oftentimes what I have seen is that a lot of the people that have come to me have been told by somebody that they might have imposter syndrome, and they didn't get mad at them. They actually felt seen, which is a bizarre thing you might not imagine, but people feel like, oh my gosh, finally somebody gets what I'm experiencing, as opposed to like, I'm being told maybe sometimes you have to explain what it is, and that, it's not a mental health issue. You may have to do some of that explaining, but I think teaching people about it and letting them know it's okay and that there are ways to deal with it is so important, because oftentimes people say, oh, I have imposter syndrome, and it's like, that's it. No, there are ways to actually concretely move the needle forward on it, but you have to know that you're struggling with it to be able to do so. And then don't accidentally reinforce it. So we talked about all the ways that you can trigger imposter syndrome. If you notice those behaviors in yourself, or you see that, don't accidentally kind of reinforce it or encourage people to be perfect, or even use that language of perfect. And, because it is reinforcing in and of itself. Trying to find ways to really allow people to, be themselves in the unique ways that they are, and also not get caught up with how you yourself may be experiencing, and also how you may be also thinking that that's a healthy way to be by overworking and overfunctioning. So when we developed the book, we literally scoured all the research on imposter syndrome, and we wanted to create a model to kind of figure out how to actually kind of move beyond imposter syndrome. And we created these 3 phases: clarify, choose, and create. And much of what we have here has been found in the literature to be actually impactful in moving the needle on imposter syndrome. Some of the things, though, were not in the literature, and we have had to think about, we sort of did a qualitative review of our clients who had imposter syndrome and what were the interventions that moved them forward. And so we added that to the model as well. So I'll show you what they are, but I'm going to explain it in a second. So it's your imposter and origin story, knowing your traps and triggers and trap doors, changing your narrative, speaking your truth, silencing your automatic negative thoughts, valuing and caring for yourself, experimenting with new roles, building a dream team, and understanding the conditions for optimal performance. So this is sort of an explanation of it. In the beginning, it's really important for people to understand where their imposter syndrome comes from. I think a lot of people have often said, oh, like, it's social media culture, and like, it's, imposter syndrome has existed long beyond social media culture. It did not, necessarily create imposter syndrome. It reinforces it, but it doesn't necessarily create it. So you have to figure out sort of how your imposter syndrome, what happened in your own early development that affected your imposter syndrome development. That is important because it helps you to understand your triggers. Oftentimes people's triggers are modeled after the things that triggered them or created it in the first place. So knowing it actually helps people then to understand what their triggers are. Knowing your triggers helps you to slow down your response. If you understand and know your triggers, when you know you're going to face them, or you are facing them, you can slow down your response and not react reactively. Instead, you can actually make a planned choice about what you do next. The next piece that's important is thickening and changing your narrative. Oftentimes people with imposter syndrome have very thin narratives of themselves, very simplistic narratives of why they do things, why they fail. But part of, helping them to deal with it is really helping them to kind of build a thicker narrative about who they are, the context that they face, the things that have made them who they are in a much thicker way. Which leads to this idea of like owning and celebrating their skills, accomplishments, experiences, learning that that isn't bragging, learning that that's not going to make them a narcissist, which is a lot of their common fears, learning that this is a really healthy and a very vital part of really overcoming their imposter syndrome. Also combating automatic negative thoughts. Last week I talked about all the different automatic negative thoughts that people with imposter syndrome tend to face, and you have to actually learn how to fight the automatic negative thoughts. So you get triggered, then you have this automatic negative thought. That negative thought then potentially sometimes produces particular behaviors that reinforce the imposter syndrome. But by learning to kind of recognize it as an automatic negative thought, labeling it, and then deciding how to rationally respond based on evidence and data helps you then to change that automatic negative thought process and actually develop more positive rational responses to the triggers. Valuing and instituting self-care practices. So oftentimes what we find is people with imposter syndrome have very, very poor self-care practices. They often don't sometimes even know what self-care is really, or the difference between Netflix and chill and self-care, but really teaching them what are the rejuvenating ways in which you can care for yourself, both mentally, physically, in reflective self-care practices, but really taking a real journey around how to do this and how to institute these practices into your life. Experimenting with new roles. So I showed you the roles that they typically hold. You want someone with imposter syndrome to take new risks, expand their role experience. And I'm going to show you some roles that they should be playing with. And really allow themselves to not just be so rigid in who they understand themselves to be, but much more broad, and allowing themselves to, you can be good at kind of, helping somebody and still at the same time ask for help or fail. There are multiple ways to be, and it is very important to their growth that they do. And then also building community. And the final piece is like really teaching them how to build a healthy community around them. Oftentimes people with imposter syndrome can be very loner-like, feel like they want to do things on their own, they can manage things on their own, but the community becomes central to overcoming your imposter syndrome and really having the kinds of voices in your life that know how to help you propel you forward, and also that you can be able to contribute to these voices reciprocally as well. But it's not just that you're getting stuff from them, you're also giving. But it's so incredibly important for people with imposter syndrome to have strong community around them. So I mentioned the new roles. So this is the kind of roles you want them to experiment. You want them to take more risks, to allow themselves to break out of this place where succeeding and being perfect is really the central focus, but that they can take risks. And sometimes those risks are not going to go so well. They're going to fail at them. But that failure and learning to fail forward is so important to that growth mentality and the growth mindset, and really helping you to really be much more expansive in how you understand yourself. Help seeking, really learning how to ask for help and receive it in a way that is almost a foreign concept for a lot of people with imposter syndrome. Asking for help and allowing somebody to help them can be incredibly painful and incredibly difficult. Receiving knowledge, being able to not be always the one that has the answers, sometimes being one who's being given the answers, and being told, and there's other people that are experts and learning from them and not having to always be the expert. Being a great collaborator, really learning the skills of collaboration and really understanding that it's okay to collaborate and that you don't always have to just trust people and feel like they're going to blow it and that's going to affect you, but really learning how to be a great collaborator, a great group member, learning how to facilitate those dynamics of group experience. And also being a visible leader, allowing yourself to be visible, to be a leader, to be able to have moments in which you have accolades and be able to stand in that and know that there's nothing wrong with that, but to be able to really take that in. So one of the things I think, in terms of community, I was thinking about sort of like the other things that are so important is like, have your students understand their resources on campus. Like one of the greatest things, on campus is all the resources that exist that we can access for free. But oftentimes because of their limited knowledge of what is available to them, especially when you have imposter syndrome, you're not looking to try to get help from anyone or admit anything that's going wrong. You can avoid getting involved in these opportunities, but, refer students to the counseling center and have them kind of be able to discuss some of this, even though it's not a mental health diagnosis, you can still talk about the things in ways it's affecting you with somebody who is knowledgeable about it. So I would encourage you to encourage them to get counseling. It's such an important, as a psychologist, I feel like, if a student hasn't been in therapy before, and a lot of them have, it's so important to get your first experience potentially in a college counseling center. It can be such an amazing, I worked in many college counseling centers and it's such an amazing place. The Office of Multicultural Education talk about like community and like finding like-minded others, finding people who have similar identity experiences, like your offices can do that. Also the Center for Career Development, like, teaching them that learning about career resources, learning, all of these things are so incredibly important. Remember when I told you in the beginning that people with imposter syndrome have limited knowledge about jobs and what the options are. They're poor negotiators. Like having exposure to career development and really getting skills can be incredibly helpful to them. So and I only talked about 3. I'm sure there are a million other offices that, you know, and that they should be talking to, but to teach them to reach outward and to build community at Holy Cross. It's so important. And then just where you can reach me. So that's my book, and I'm on Instagram, and I'm on Twitter, not as often, but I'm on it, and I'm a top voice on LinkedIn as well. So I talk about imposter syndrome and career all the time there. So now I'm just going to open it up to questions.
Thank you so much, Dr. Orbe-Austin. I know I'll be watching this again to write down some ideas for future events, programs, and opportunities to partner with folks on campus, but also would love to hear more comments, feedback, questions from colleagues as they think about this content for their own functional area or department. And I know from this presentation, you've raised many questions for us to think about from our different roles. So I want to thank you for the opportunity to sit and reflect on how we do our work and how we can push forward to serve students in a better and more efficient capacity. So at this point, I welcome folks to drop questions in the chat. If you'd like to say your question or ask it directly to Dr. Orbe-Austin, you can put an X in the chat, and I will moderate and call on folks. But we can give about a minute or so to see if anyone has questions that they'd like to ask specific about the presentation, or any questions you have about how to use the information in your role. I see Tina in the chat.
Was that your calling on me, Michelle?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. I want to thank you for the wonderful presentation. So much information crammed in there, and like Michelle, I heard the presentation of the students too, so some of this was familiar, but man, you can talk fast.
Yes, I'm a New Yorker. Sorry.
That's okay. That's okay. I was just wondering, I've Googled just a tiny bit on this, but I'm wondering, since you are such an expert on stereotypes or on imposter syndrome, what have you learned about imposter syndrome in international students? I'm the assistant dean for international students, so I'm particularly curious about that and ways that I might be helpful.
It's a really good question. I mean, I think that there isn't, like I said, around identity variables, there isn't a lot being done. You know, I wish there was more being done. I think, you know, one of the things that I've seen most predominantly is sort of the insecurities around kind of competence and intelligence around, or like being considered intelligent and competent around issues of accent, issues of feeling like, you know, there's sort of missing experiences that, you know, they may not have that American students have. So I often see that, I think, most predominantly, and that's where I think I see a lot of the concern about being an imposter is around language, around accent, around feeling like they're missing experiences that make them feel disconnected from the experience. So I do think it's so important, like we were talking about before, is for them for international students to be able to talk to other international students, especially I imagine like being able to do that in a mentoring experience where somebody who is more senior to them can kind of be able to kind of talk through that experience with them. I think it can be very validating to kind of hear other people's, both being able to identify with the experience and then also simultaneously being able to have dealt with it in some way where they've come to some kind of grips with the fact that they are intelligent and can be and have these experiences simultaneously. You know.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you, Tina. We have a few comments in the chat. Great presentation, focused on transition of cycle from seeing one pattern from past terminology in literature, but now seeing it shift towards another. This idea of the open secret and how it's very necessary in systems of higher education to kind of talk about some of the dysfunction that exists. And that's across the nation, I would imagine that.
Yeah, I want to make one more comment on that particular one. Is I think that, I remember something that happened in my doctoral program that was pretty impactful, and I had a very dysfunctional mentor. So part of the reason I know this so well is I've lived a lot of it myself, not just the research, but I've lived it. And I remember one time going to see a dean to try to get reassigned to a new mentor. And I remember sitting and I made the appointment. I sat with the dean. I was telling them what happened. And the dean told me to stand up, to leave their office, and to never come back again. That they knew what was going on, but they could do nothing about it. And they didn't want to be involved in having this discussion with me. And so it was one of those moments where I recognized, wow, this guy's really powerful. The dean's telling me to imagine that I never even to his office. And it just made it clear, to me, about how in academic institutions, sometimes dysfunction really gets protected in really powerful ways, and the messages are sent to you really clearly, you don't have choice about what's happening. So I so believe in dysfunction destroying, and especially in institutions in which it's protected,
Yeah, and I think for many of us, we can understand that from our own kind of experience in higher ed as undergrad students, graduate students, professionals, that conflict isn't the easiest thing to navigate at any level, especially if your style is a bit more averse to conflict. So, so great point. Appreciate folks bringing that up in the chat. We do have a question from Derek, and the question is, you touched upon this a bit, but what are your thoughts on mentors having the same versus different identities as mentees, and if one is preferable in terms of reducing imposter syndrome for mentees?
I think it depends. I know it's not the best answer. It's not the most fun answer, but it sort of depends. It's not really the identity that sometimes can matter if they haven't processed how the identity has impacted their work or their own imposter syndrome. If they're engaging in behavior that's completely unhealthy, their identity won't matter. And so it's really much more important that they sometimes have the identity and also have done the work. You have to do both in some ways. I've had mentors of a similar identity who've reinforced my imposter syndrome profoundly. And so it's really important to really have someone who's actually can understand how it operates and how it works and how they have kind of dealt with it, is much more productive.
Thank you so much. So the next question I have is how to navigate relationships with peers or students who don't experience imposter syndrome and can see this as just doubt. How can they handle those types of conversations?
It's a really good question. I think it came up in the student one about parents who don't or parents who say this isn't a thing, or are you kidding me? This is what you're dealing with. I think it's really common, I think, for people, even sometimes people who have imposter syndrome themselves, to dismiss what it is, or kind of suggest all you have to do is say a good affirmation and it'll work on your affirmations. It's much more complex than that to deal with that. There are a variety of layers you have to deal with. And so I think, you can educate them about sort of what imposter syndrome is and what it isn't, and talk to them about it. Or you can make decisions and choices about sort of how effective they can be in your process of dealing with this, and be able to, set emotional boundaries. If they're not receptive to hearing or listening or learning, then maybe, thinking about your emotional boundaries and how much you're going to let them into your process is important.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
And I think this might be the last question that's in the chat that I see. How can I give praise to a student that they will receive as authentic? Make it clear that I mean it, and no, I don't say the same thing to everyone. It's
a great question. So it reminds me of the question too, what I get asked often is how do I help somebody with imposter syndrome when I can see the imposter syndrome happening in vivo? And I think it's really hard, because when you have imposter syndrome, you're really quick to dismiss praise. So if somebody gives you praise, you're like, oh, thanks, but I screwed up, or it wasn't just me, it was all these other people, or feeling oh, maybe this perception that you tell this to everyone. And I think what is so important is to kind of encourage, kind of ask them or kind of explore with them sort of why is their experience, it usually has nothing to do with you. And so I don't know if how you're going to frame it's going to matter, but having to explore with them, why is it difficult to take in the feedback? What's happening for them? Do they have difficulty taking in feedback? Do they understand why that is? And if it feels like it's really deep and it's something, to being able to refer them, you might want to talk to someone about that, because, taking in positive feedback is so central to being able to recognize your strengths and your skills and your abilities. So teaching them about how important it is to take in positive feedback, because sometimes we've been taught that it isn't. It's better to be humble. It's better to dismiss it, but it's actually quite unhealthy to do that. And I think sometimes culturally we get taught that, like, it's not okay to take in, to take someone's praise. It's better to kind of defer it, but it's not necessarily all that healthy long term.
Thank you. I have a follow-up personally on what you just answered. I find that I try to, if I give student feedback, like directly when we were in person, whatever that means nowadays, but like when you give it directly to a student, I try to also write it in an email or follow up with them to like put it in a place that they can maybe view it again. Because I find when I am hard to hear feedback, whether positive or negative, writing it down helps me to come back to it with more clarity so that I can take it in. Is there literature, or is there anything in your experience that you find that there are tactics that make it more concrete and more tangible for folks to deal with on their own time who are struggling with imposter syndrome?
Well, it's a good question. I mean, it reminds me of like the literature on like different types of learners, like oral learners and, auditory and lexical learners. Like there are different types of learning. So sometimes, giving people feedback in other ways can be helpful. And it also reminded me of something really important around feedback, which is like oftentimes what's useful about feedback is when someone gives you something very concrete about, like, they give you the actual example. When you did this, I thought it was excellent because of X or Y, but they give them a really concrete behavioral feedback so they understand what is exactly being complimented and what is the thing that you're noticing that is the growth moment. And so I think that's really helpful, because then people can really feel like it's super concrete and clear. Like they gave me an example of it, as opposed to like you're giving everyone that example. You actually can see that that was in your particular behavior and that's what they're noticing. So I think that can be really helpful. It also helps people to be able to isolate the strength, right? They see, oh, this is a particular skill that I have. It's very concrete, as opposed to good job, but having something more rich to say to them that's useful to take other places.
Awesome. I'll just ask another question before we end.
Sure.
Because we have a few minutes left. This is more around supervision. If you are managing, supervising, working with people who you are picking up on tendencies that you want to support them navigating imposter syndrome as professionals, and you want to be a good colleague or partner on a project, like how do you do that in a professional way that doesn't seem insulting or too territorial, like you're just overstepping in a way, but you're to help the person take in feedback or notice that they are doing a great job or XYZ, especially in a culture like ours, which is super competitive and we strive for excellence. I think that might be a good piece to end on. How do you reaffirm people in an environment, especially virtual, around imposter syndrome that you work with? That may be a little different than doing it with students, because that seems almost innate to a college.
Right. I mean, I think it's really, for me, it's around creating environments in which people can both, the people are giving each other positive feedback and reinforcing good and positive things, and also giving people constructive feedback, right? And doing it in ways that are aimed at people's growth, and that everyone can both receive the positive feedback and get the critical feedback, right? And I think that, I think it's creating these cultures in which it's okay, right, to hear both good things about what you're doing and also, things that aren't so great. And for everyone to be able to take it in a way that's grateful for the feedback, because people who give you constructive feedback generally, if it's constructive, not critical and hurting, but it's meant, they want to see you grow, they want to see you gain. And if that's sort of the culture that you're creating, I think it makes it so much easier to be able to kind of do it and hear it, and for people to kind of do it in response. So I think for leaders to be able to take constructive feedback and be like, thank you so much, and then do something with it. Like take the feedback and go, do something behavioral with it so that people see that you took it in. I think it models a really healthy relationship around feedback. Rather than telling people, they say, instead of tell, you show. So model really healthy, experiences of feedback and being able to take both types and being able to be resilient to it. I think it's so incredibly important.